Well, let's turn now to the apology delivered by the Prime Minister on behalf of Parliament. This for the presence of a Ukrainian veteran at last week's historic speech from President Zelensky, because as we now know, that veteran was invited by the former Speaker Anthony Rota and had fought in World War II for the Nazis.
On behalf of all of us in this House, I would like to present unreserved apologies for what took place on Friday and to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation for the position they were put in. For all of us who were present to have unknowingly recognized this individual was a terrible mistake and a violation of the memory of those who suffered grievously at the hands of the Nazi regime.
Well, to talk about the week events, we are now joined by Robert Fife, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Stephanie Levitz is national reporter for the Toronto Star, and Laura Osman, political reporter for the Canadian Press. Hello to the three of you.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
So obviously a very busy week, another busy week on the Hill, but I want to begin here with the question that was asked of the Prime Minister yesterday, because as you know, he was asked about whether or not Kyiv or Zelensky has responded to the apology that we just heard. And in answering the question, we got a non-answer from the Prime Minister, essentially saying, well, we support Ukraine. What do you take out of the question and the way he responded to that, Bob?
Well, first of all, let me just say I'm appalled by the government's response on this. It took the Prime Minister 5 days to apologize on behalf of the Canada, both to President Zelensky, but on behalf of the Canadian government to the world. It took 4 days for this Anthony Rota to do the right thing, which is to resign. If he had resigned on Monday, he would have been regarded as an honorable person. And, you know, goodness knows he might have been able to win the Speaker's thing if he allowed his name to stay in, because he did the right thing. But the Prime Minister should have come out on Monday and said, on behalf of Canadians, I offer my deepest apologies. And we did not do that. And Rota did not do that. The Ukrainians were really upset about this. Why? Because they didn't even need fake Russian disinformation campaigns to use against the Ukrainians, because they've been saying the Ukrainians are supportive of are Nazis. And so there we go. We got a Nazi in the House of Commons, and we're all clapping at him. And so they were really, really upset. They're obviously not going to come out and say anything critical of the Canadian government, because we've given them a lot of money and for weapons and arms and financial aid, and they're not going to do that. But up privately, they'll tell you they're really upset.
Well, you know, and from that point, you know, the silence is deafening on this one. If he can't answer how Kyiv or Zelensky has responded to the apology, Stephanie, what do you make of it?
I make of it a failure of leadership. And not just on the part of the Prime Minister. I think it's a failure of leadership for all of the elected members of Parliament who were in the House that day. I think everyone can apologize. I don't think it just needs to be the Prime Minister standing up on behalf of the Parliament of Canada, which is important and should stand. But they were all there, and why they all need to apologize is because it was a shocking moment where it's clear that we all forgot our history. And while we can talk about the Prime Minister should have come out on Monday and apologized, actually the Prime Minister should have come out on Saturday and apologized, because that's when this started coming out, when everyone started realizing. And I think I take the point of those who say, well, in the moment, you know, maybe they weren't listening, and maybe, you know, everyone starts clapping, so you just get on your feet, you start clapping. We can make time for that, okay? But once it became clear what had happened, this idea, yes, it was Anthony Rota who extended the invitation, but everybody stood up and clapped. And so everybody owes an apology. It's an embarrassment for Canada. And the Prime Minister's answer that we support Ukraine, no one's doubting that. That's not the issue here. No one thinks this means that we're not going to give military support to Ukraine or that we actually side with Russia. That's a ridiculous answer. The answer is it's embarrassing what happened here, and you should apologize, Prime Minister, because Volodymyr Zelensky, you pick up the phone and call him at the drop of a hat. You can pick up the phone and call him now.
Well, you know, you talk about responsibility, and Laura, I'm going to ask you about, you know, the Conservatives keep saying that it's not just Anthony Rota, and I hear what you're saying, Stephanie, that every member of Parliament needs to apologize. But when you listen to what the Conservatives are now saying, they say the Prime Minister bears responsibility for what happened and should do a personal apology as well. What do you say to that?
You know, I think the Conservatives have a point to an extent that, you know, there's a greater responsibility here in the House of Commons. I think as Stephanie said, every one person who stood up and clapped owes an apology for what happened. It was a huge embarrassment for Canada. We know what happened here in terms of how this happened in broad strokes, I think a postmortem is important. The Conservatives are calling for that to an extent, but they don't want to hear from the Speaker. They want to hear from the Prime Minister. And so I think that's interesting that the Conservatives are saying they don't want to accept collective responsibility for what happened. There isn't a level of collective responsibility here for everyone in Parliament and everyone in Canada who didn't pick up that what had happened.
Laura's absolutely right on this. The Conservatives are trying to politicize this and make this an issue with the Prime Minister should bear all responsibility for this. But look, I mean, when they said that this was a Ukrainian hero and a Canadian hero, and, you know, okay, he fought against the Russians, okay, he then fought for the Germans. And anybody with a rudimentary understanding of the history of the Second World War knows that there were Ukrainians who were part of the death squads, killing Jews and Poles and Slavic. So everybody is responsible for this. They all, I think to Stephanie's point, everybody owes an apology. Everybody was let down by the stupid move by Anthony Rota, but everybody got up and clapped. And it's really not the right thing to be able just to point fingers. Oh, it's all the Prime Minister's responsibility. Everybody's responsible, including us in the media, by the way. Yeah. We should have jumped on that right away, and we failed.
Yeah, agreed.
It took a Jewish a newspaper in the United States to break this story, and that's a failing on our behalf.
Well, and to that, you know, the failure of history, we're now hearing B'nai B'rith, supported by a number of different groups across the country, saying, you know, this is actually a wake-up call for Ottawa. They need to release the full and unredacted Deschênes report that was published or put together back in the 80s that had to do with Nazis that came into Canada. Parts of that, the second part of that report, never shared. What do you make of that call, Stephanie?
Absolutely legitimate. I mean, it was legitimate from the day the call started getting made, and it's even more legitimate now. I mean, every year that goes by, we are losing the very people who bore witness to the Second World War, who survived the Holocaust, who fought you know, with the partisans for you know, a freer Europe. We are losing them. We are losing their testimonies. We are losing their points of view. And to be able to make public history, to fully understand what happened during the Second World War and the aftermath of it, the way in which countries like Canada were complicit in letting in alleged or known war criminals. It is never more important than it is now, because as incidents as this show, when we forget our history, it is embarrassing, it is dangerous, it undercuts democracy, and I know I sound maybe a bit excessive here, but never has it been more important for us to understand history and to understand what we did in the past, so that we don't keep doing it again, so that we don't keep honoring the very same people who have no business being honored.
Can I just interject? Sorry, Laura. But, you know, one of the great historians, Irving Abella, who just recently died, and he wrote a fabulous book about None Are Too Many. He said that it was easier if you were a Nazi war criminal, it was easier to get in Canada if you were a Jew. And that is Canadian history. And we can't lose face of that. We've got to take this seriously. And you're absolutely right. This is a learning moment for Canadians.
Well, and to that, you know, when you talk about this multicultural Canada, that's a concept that came about in the 70s. So there's a long history before that, of course, going to World War II, the Nazis. Laura, last word to you, as we're quickly losing time right now.
Well, I think if there's one silver lining to this horrific and extremely embarrassing incident for Canada, it may be that we do take a deeper look at our history, and that we're seeing momentum build up around these calls that have been coming for a very long time to open up the Deschênes report, take a look at it, and really closely examine what Canada's role was in the aftermath of the Second World War.
Well, without a doubt, you know, this incident, from the speech to the revelation last weekend, not over, the controversy, but for now, Bob, Stephanie, Laura, thank you very much for the time today.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.